record. So, like I said, a lot of different applications of the question of making tents on Shabbat. Now, most of these applications are not permanent tents. The Issa D'Oraisa, the Torah prohibition of an oyel, is an oyel keva. And in a minute, we'll see this inside in the sources. I'd like to see this from inside. You know, it's more of a Eon share, so I'm happy to actually see some sources and anchor what we're saying in the primary texts. But most of the examples that we're speaking about, whether it's making a makeshift tent for your kids on Shabbos out of chairs and a sheet, whether it's spreading out your canopy on the pram, on the stroller, even placing a kind of some kind of a talus or something, right, to have shade. That's all an oil arai. A gazebo, on the other hand, putting up a proper gazebo, that could be an oil keva, right? So that could be a Torah prohibition. So Bekitzer, hello David, nice to see you. So Bekitzer, a lot of very interesting and very important ramifications. Of course, one of the big questions of tents on Shabbos, here you go, is a question of umbrellas. Are you allowed to walk around on Shabbat with an umbrella, or to open an umbrella on Shabbos? What about a sukkah? If you have a sukkah, are you allowed to close your sukkah on Shabbos or on Yom Tov? Is that a problem of oil, to put an additional cover on top of the sukkah when it starts raining, as it often does in England? I think this year we had rain in England on Sukkot, Baruch Hashem, not here. So would that be a problem? So all of these issues are issues that emerge from learning the sugya, from learning the different sources that we'll try to go through. And you know what, let's start from, I think it's page number 5 on the pages that you have. Have a look at page number 5. Page number 5 is a Shulchan Aruch. The main siman in Shulchan Aruch that deals with the laws of making tents on Shabbos is siman Shin Tesvav, Arachaim Shin Tesvav. And it's a pretty complicated siman. Generally, the prohibition of making a tent is included in Boine. It's called building. But this is a specific part of Boine, right? Oyel, making a tent, and Shin Tesvav. And have a look at the Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Yud Zayin. Okay, you'll see it's more or less 6 lines from the bottom. Do you see it? Sif Katan Yud Zayin. All right. So it says as follows. The Mishnah Berurah decides over here, like halfway through the siman, to give us an introduction. All right. So he says, you know what? Let's give an introduction on what is this prohibition all about. Okay, so I'm going to read it. Please read together with me. In order to well understand es divrei haseif, the following clause. I've got a few more. All right, here you go. Please. We're on page 5 of the sources, Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Yud Zayin. Okay, so it says as follows. He says, I'm going to give you a short introduction. Hakdama Ktsara. Behu. The Aftelin in Binyan Keva, Afim Asa Ezeb Dvar Mashu Lahosef Ala Binyan, if there's a fixed building, even if you do something small to add on to the building, Bein B'mechitza, is Bein B'gag, Chayav, then you're Chayav, whether you add to the building, the walls, or the roof. If you have a house, right, there is a boiner, and you just hammer a nail into the wall, that itself, hammering a nail into the wall, is a Torah prohibition of boiner. All right, don't do it. What about putting a plug into the wall? Question mark. Is that also a prohibition of boiner? The answer is not really. Why not? Because a plug is something very temporary, right? It's made for going in and out, right? Is closing a door a prohibition of boina? Right? The answer is no. Even though by closing the door, you're fixing the door onto the wall, and now you're building something together with the wall. It's not a problem. Why? Because doors are meant for opening and closing, and therefore we don't look at the action of closing a door as an action of building. Rather, it's closing a door. But when you're fixing something onto the wall, even if it's a nail, even if it's something small, that's boina. So that's a problem. But with respect to oil, he says things are different. Let's read how he says it. Says kolagag, mikol makom, nonetheless, le'inyan oil arai, if it's a temporary tent, an oil arai, a temporary tent, lo asru ba'oise es a gag lechud. If you make the roof alone, this is not an isur. Im lo she'oise es a gag, kedei lahagen mipnei hachama. The isur of an oil, says the Mishnah Berurah, is only if you're making the roof in order to protect what's under the roof from the sun or from the rain. Then it's a bit like an oil. Otherwise, it's not asur. Unless you do the roof and the walls. All right, so summing up so far, says the Mishnah Berurah, there's two different categories of oil, which he didn't expand on right here. It's actually in Sif Aleph that the Shulchan Aruch speaks about it. There's something called an oil keva, meaning a permanent oil, a permanent tent, and there's something called an oil arai, a temporary tent, okay? An oil keva, which the Shulchan Aruch says several days, kama yomim, right? The Mishnah Berurah says also, I think it's in Sif Katan Chaf. Have a quick look. He says, whatever it is, he says kama yomim, several days. How many days exactly, right? We like our shiurim to be precise. You know, we want very. Tell us, Rabbi, how many days exactly? The answer is, there's no sure answer to this question. Everything depends on the circumstances. Is this something that we look at as a permanent construct? Or is this something that we see as something very transient, something very temporary? So the Torah prohibition of making an oil is an oil keva, and the oil keva is also if you're making a roof, which is going to be a protective roof over something that's underneath, that's an oil keva if it's permanent, and that's the Issa D'Oraisa. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah is speaking about something called an oil arai, a temporary tent. And here he says that there are two types of temporary tents. One type is a tent that's protecting what's underneath. And then he says that's also even without walls. However, if it's not protecting what's underneath, but rather its main purpose is what's on top of it, for example, a bed, okay, or a table, okay, tables, beds, and so on, they're mainly for what's on top. They're not for what's underneath. So there, the prohibition will only apply when you also have walls. If you don't have walls, then it's not a problem, right? Then it's not going to be prohibited. Okay, so it says the Mishnah Berurah here, right? Lo asru kim ba'isa mechitzos shetachtav b'Shabbos. Then he says, gam lo asru, and that's only asur kim k'she'asher keseder, if you do it in the right order. Mitchila hamechitzos, first the walls, v'achar and then hakisui, and then the cover. The oz demiktas lo el keva, because then it's a bit like a real tent. But if you do the other way around, then lo asru, then it's not asur. But yesh poskim, he says, shesovrim, that they believe the beinan she'tzarech gam kein la'avish tachtov, Meaning, like I mentioned before, a bed, sometimes you use a bed for the area underneath the bed. Okay, for example, to keep your shoes under, or some beds have storage space underneath. So you're using the space that's under the bed as well as using the space on top of the bed. And then you have a prohibition if you make the walls. However, if you're not using the space underneath at all, then there's no prohibition even if you build the walls. And the example of that, there's a machlokes between the poskim. What's the halacha of a table? Okay, is a table used only for placing things on top of a table, or is a table also used for being underneath a table? And number one, I guess kids can crawl under the table and play games, but more specifically, the question is, you put your feet under the table, is that considered using the top of the table to shield, to protect your legs from stuff falling down? So it's actually a machlokes poskim about a table, whether there would be a prohibition of making an oil, of making a tent, by placing the top cover of a table above legs, or above walls, rather, whether that would be a prohibition or not. Okay, so that's the summary that the Mishnah Berurah presents. Tables have walls. Well, tables can have walls. Generally speaking, tables don't have walls, they only have legs. And because they only have legs, then there wouldn't be any prohibition of making a table on Shabbos. That's why we can put up our, folding tables. Folding tables is a whole other issue, and we'll speak about that presently. But even if it's not a folding table, it's a table that you put up the legs, and then you put up the top, whatever you call it, slab or the wood of the table, that would also be okay. It would be okay because there are no walls. Abba Condition, we'll see about that later. The Abba Condition is a way of supporting the canopy. Now, the Abba Condition themselves, they're not walls. They're not proper walls. However, there would be a problem if it's an oil keva. If it's an oil arai, then if it's lefia seder, meaning if it's lefia seder and you're using it for protection of what's underneath, then you have a problem. Because even without walls, if it's there for giving you shade from the sun or protection from the rain, then even without walls, you have a problem of oil arai on Shabbos, right? Well, generally speaking, when you're adding a leaf to the table, that would just be considered being moisif, adding to an existing oil. Oh. And the leaves serve as proper like walls to the table? They hide underneath. All right, so if they're only hiding underneath, then it sounds like it's not it's not a real wall. Right, but again, the table is there already, so you're not creating a new table. So, so you're okay anyway. The question would be putting that up on Shabbos. So if it's a foldable kind of table, then like we'll see later, that's going to be permitted. That's going to be mutter to put it up anyway if it's one of these folding tables. But if it's something that you build, then we're going to be getting into the machlokes poskim whether tables are considered an oil because you put your feet under or not. Tachlis, the minig, the common custom, is to be makel on that specific issue. So let's have a quick look at the Gemora in source number 1. Okay, in the source sheet number 1. First of all, the first Gemara, Shabbos Kuf Lamed Ches, right? The final line. All right. Now we've said already an oil keva a permanent tent is a chiyuv chatos. That's an issa d'oraisa. That's making a proper tent on Shabbos. And I would say, this is uncommon for us. We don't usually make permanent tents at all. But if you're going camping or something, right, and you put up a proper tent, a permanent tent, which can last for a good few days, this is a solid tent, that would be your real issa d'oraisa of oil on Shabbos. These gezebos, right, gazebos, proper good tents, they can last for a long time. Those could be a proper issa d'oraisa on Shabbos. What's more common for us, certainly in our everyday circumstances of using prams and strollers and sheets and beds and whatever, that's an oil arai, okay? And the Gemara Kuf Chaf Hey, the Gemara says, right, Amar Rabba Bar Chana Rav Yechanan, Hakol Moedim, everybody agrees, She'ein oisin oil arai betchila b'yom tov ve'in tzarech leima b'Shabbos. Right, making an oil arai is certainly forbidden. It's certainly also on Shabbos. I'll just mention Rashi here. Rashi says about oil arai, lifrois machzeles al daled mechitzos, oy daled kundesim, you're putting up a sheet, a proper oil, lius tseil le oil minachama, all right, to provide shade from the sun. Okay, so says the Gemara, to make an oil arai, that's an iso d'Rabbanan. Loi nechlaku, where is there a machlokes, says the Gemara, ela lehoisif, adding on an existing oil. Okay, so that's the issue of an oil arai. And in the next Gemara, which I'm not going to read now because it's going to take us time, but it's very interesting, the Gemara. The next Gemara tells us that if you make the oil in an irregular way, by reversing the order, meaning generally speaking, how do you make an oil on Shabbos? You first put up the walls, the support, and then you put up the roof. The Gemara says that if you do it the other way around, first you have the roof, and then you bring in the walls, then it's mutter. Meaning Chazal said you're not allowed to make a temporary tent on Shabbos, but if you do it in an irregular way, by first putting up the roof and then bringing in the support, then it's mutter, all right? And that's true even if it's there for the purpose of shade. It's true there's some discussion about this in Poskim, but the Chazon Ish and others say very clearly, and that's what seems to be from this Gemara. This Gemara is speaking about you want to make shade for somebody who died on Shabbos. You want to provide him with protection from the elements, and the way in which you do that is by reversing the order of the roof and then the mechitzos, and that's mutter on Shabbos. That only works for the Rabbanan. For the Araisa, it doesn't help. No. You know what? For the Araisa, it might help also because it'll make it into the Rabbanan because you're doing it with a shinui. For the Daraisa, it would help because it'll be a shinui. For the Darabanan, it helps because Chazal were makel. Generally speaking, even in Issa Darabanan and Shabbos, it's not mutter to do it even with a shinui, unless there's, some special circumstances. Over here, Chazal are makel to do it with a shinui. Yes, some say that you need a special tzorech, but most people can say this is a special color, and it's mutter under any circumstances to make the oil arai. If you're doing it in this unusual way. No, binyan keva, you can't. Binyan oil keva is an issa d'oraisa. No, even a tzerich gadol doing it with a shunay wouldn't be allowed. Again, if you do it a trade d'Rabbanan, you bring in a goy and then doing it with a shunay and a tzerich mitzvah, then there's room to be makel depending on the circumstances. But stamazoi to do a shinui would be a d'Rabbanan, and generally speaking, poskim are not very happy being makel just with a shinui, even when there's a major tzorech. Again, depends on the specific circumstances. So let's have a quick look at the Shulchan Aruch in Seif Gimel, okay? Seif Gimel is the case that we mentioned before of the bed, okay? And here we learn that mita, if you have a bed, shema midimoisa, when you are erecting, when you're setting up your bed, right? Asar lahaniach haraglaim techila. You're not allowed to first have the legs, ulaniach aleim akroshim, and then to place the sheets, meaning the wood of the bed, the panels of the bed, on top. Ela yasem akroshim techila ba'avir ve'achar kach haraglaim tachteim. So this is exactly the halachah that we mentioned now, based on this Gemora in Daf Mem Gimel, that if you do it in the reverse order, all right, if you first put up the roof, first you put up the top, and then you bring in the legs, then it's mutter, all right. Now, another halacha that we learned over here is that you're allowed to be moisef ala oil, right? We saw that this is a machlekes about whether you're allowed to be moisef ala oil or not. Now again, moisef ala oil, very important. Only on an oil arai, all right? Only on a temporary oil, not on a oil keva, right? You know what? Let me just mention one point. What is an oil? All right? What defines an oil? Right? So, like we said, an oil is a canopy that provides shade and so on. But what happens if it's if it comes to a point, it's not a flat surface, all right? So the definition of an oil, as the Shulchan Aruch Paskin Sif Aleph, is only if you have an oil tefach. You need to have a flat tefach, okay? And flat, again, the question is what angle makes it not flat? So the angle is if we're within a slope of 3 tefachim of height, you don't have a tefach in length, okay? So I didn't figure out what angle that is, but if you have a sharp angle coming to a point, that's not called an oil keva. Even if it's permanent, that's only called an oil arai, all right? To be an oil keva, you need to have a tefach at the top. That's called an oil keva. Okay, good. So, and let me just point out, Sif Zayin, all right, Sif Zayin is on page 8 in our notes. Sif Zayin, all right, just in case you're worried about this, says the Shulchan Aruch, Mutar la'aniach sefer echad mikan, ve'echad mikan, ve'echad al gabein. You're allowed to put up, all right? You have one book here and another book here, and you have another book that's resting on these 2 books. All right, so it sounds like we have an oil. All right, we have a tent. Why is that mutter? The answer is because you're not interested in the space under the middle book. It's not providing you with protection. It's not giving you shade. It's not, sheltering you from the elements. And that's why it's mutter, says the Ramah, because you're not interested in the avir underneath. By the way, the next seif ches, kol oil meshupa she'ein begagoy tefach, v'loy bepachas mishloisha samach legagoy reichav tefach, hari ze oil arai. All right, that is our oil arai. If there's no tefach at the top, then it's always considered an oil arai. Now, one of the halachas that we saw in the Gemora here is the halacha of moisef ala oil, right? We saw that everybody agreed you're not allowed to create a temporary oil, a temporary tent on Shabbos. However, there's a machlokes about adding, and we saw the opinion of the Chachamim is that you're allowed to add on to an oil arai on Shabbos. What does it mean to add on to an oil arai? Have a look. Rashi explains. Says Rashi, this is in page number 1. In the second source of Kuf Chaf Hey, says Rashi lehoisif, kagoin shehaya machatzeles prusa alein. There was already a canopy. There was already something that was spread on top. Ukrucha, and it's rolled up. V'nishar ba'avir ulamacha poishta and now you want to expand it, all right? You want to spread it out, all right? That's mutter. Why? The meisif be'almahu. All you're doing is adding on, because all you're doing is adding on to an existing oil. So because it's an oil arai, it's mutter to add on, okay? Now, the Shulchan Aruch speaks about this in Siman Shin Aleph, all right, in Siman Shin Aleph. And over there's a machlokes. What's the problem of well, you know what? Let me get to that in the middle in a minute. This halacha of the Tosefes ala oil is in Seif base. Over here it's page 5. Okay, page 5. And over here the Shulchan Aruch says, all right. You know what? I'm not going to read the whole thing now, but just look at 3 lines from the bottom, right? Mutter lifros aleim b'Shabbos machzeles. If you already have a tefach which is spread out, then you're allowed to add additional length onto that on Shabbos, right? Why? Because it's tosefes oil arai v'shori. Because this is an addition to an oil arai, and therefore it's mutter. And this is the reason why it's mutter to open up, right, the roof of a buggy on Shabbos. If you have a pram, a stroller, and you want to open up the roof on Shabbos in order to protect the baby, then that's mutter on Shabbos, provided that there's already a tefach before Shabbos. So it's very important to make sure that you've already opened it up a little bit before Shabbos to the extent of a tefach. Once you've done that before Shabbos, then on Shabbos you're allowed to extend it further. There's no problem of extending it further on Shabbos, provided that it was already extended a small way before Shabbos. What if it's rolled up before Shabbos? It's not extended, but it's rolled up, okay? You have something which is rolled up and now you want to unroll it. Is that rolled up element called an oil? Mr. Bura says it's not. Actually, machlokes, Mr. Bura says it's not. That's not good enough. It has to be already extended. If it's rolled up, that's not called an oil. The oil is only once it's already been unraveled to some degree. And the same thing for the roof of the stroller. The fact that you have a semi-roof which is fixed in place, that's not good enough. You have to extend the extendable part, at the very least a tefach, and then you can extend it beyond that on Shabbos, because it's called meisif. That's called adding on to an oil arai. The piece underneath. Yeah. What about that? That's an excellent question. That's exactly the case of a bed. The case of a bed is a case of a surface that the main use is for on top of the surface. However, it's also used for protecting stuff beneath it. So the main use of a stroller is clearly to put the baby on top. However, there's an additional use, I guess it's a peripheral use, you would say, for protection of stuff underneath, right? And that's what we saw in the Shulchan Aruch in Seif Gimel about the mitzvah, right? That there it would only be a problem if you have walls, but if there are no walls, then it's fine. And therefore, in the case of the stroller, because there's no walls there, and the main use isn't for underneath, but rather for on top, so then that would be fine. But yeah, good application. Good application. Now, I was beginning to mention Seif Shin Aleph. Seif Shin Aleph speaks about a fascinating question. I think maybe I have it in the sources here. Yeah, in page 9. Seif Shin Aleph is a fascinating question, which relates to the very interesting question of, are you allowed to wear hats on Shabbos? All right. Seems like the minig is lahakel on this. But the question is it actually mutter? Right? Obviously, minhag Yisrael Torah, Chalila, Lefakpik, v'chule, v'chule. But what's going on with hats on Shabbos? So the Gemara is in Eruvin Daf Kuf Beis, and the Gemara in Eruvin speaks about whether you're allowed to wear a firm hat, like a hat made of felt, a strong hat on Shabbos or not. And the Gemara says, I don't remember the lashon inside. I think I have it on one of the sources here. But the Gemara says mutar lo tisbo b'Shabbos. Then the Gemara brings a contradiction and says we find in the Brisa that it's also to wear a hat on Shabbos. And the Gemara answers, this is where there's a tefach in the brim, and this is where there's no tefach in the brim. And you'll see some people in hat shops measuring the brims of their hats. Is it a tefach or is it less than a tefach? All right. What's the problem if it's a tefach? So actually, there's a question of how to understand this. I won't read it all inside. It's here in your source sheet number 9. Whether the problem here is a problem of oyel or the problem is a problem of carrying in Rishus HaRabim. And the Shulchan Aruch in Shin Aleph in Sif Mem, the Shulchan Aruch says, you know what, let's read this inside. It's Sif Mem in the Shulchan Aruch. It's on the source sheet in page 9. The Shulchan Aruch is down below where you'll see the Mishabura, and above that Hilchas Shabbos Siman Shin Aleph, you'll see Sif Mem. All right, kova, you have a hat. So mishpashet le'alon b'roshei tefach. It goes beyond your head, right? This is your brim. It goes beyond your head to the shiur of 1 tefach. All right, says the Shulchan Aruch, asur la'anichai b'roshei. You're not allowed to wear it. Afilu b'bayis, even when you're at home. Mishum oyel. Guys, pay attention. No hats on Shabbos. If it's a tefach, all right? Now, the Mishabura obviously has some issue with this because the general minig seems to be lehakel, all right? So how do we get around this? So, says the Mishabura, right, it's in Sifkat on Kufnan Aleph, down below, he says, Davka k'shahaya hasafa she'yitzia kasha b'yoser. It's only when it's a very firm hat, right? Only when it's like a Rosh Yeshivish hat, which are these really strong, what are they called? I don't remember what they're called. Yeah, like bowlers. The Rosh Yeshivas call them something else. Because I long ago gave up on my aspirations to become a Rosh Yeshiva, so I've even forgotten what these hats are called. They have like this Yiddish name for them. But in any case, they're like really strong. They're very firm. So it says in Mishbura, only with these really firm hats, then you have to take out your tape measure and figure out, is this a tefach or not? All right? But if it's a softer hat, if it's not that firm, then says in Mishabura, then we're not worried. All right? Ve'enu nichbaf, then it's an oyel. Bilav hachi, hariyuke glima be'alma, then it's like a cloak. Then you're okay, and we're not worried. So therefore, generally speaking, yeah, if you have like a baseball cap is an instant question, a baseball cap, yeah, why didn't I think of that one? Yeah, you want to put on a baseball cap to protect you from the sun. They're definitely for protection. No, once they've been made for protection, then we also add in some fashion elements. But the original purpose of the hat is, to protect you. What's the original purpose of the primordial hat? Presumably, to protect you. Yes, but again, now we've come fashion and gentlemen wear gentleman hats. But the concept of a hat is to provide you with warmth and with protection. If it's not for protection, just wear a woolly hat. Like. Well, yes, I agree. Now that we've got hats, we're also worried about the hats. But the hats themselves are to worry about us. Well, you know what? Let's read the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah in the next Sifkot on Kufnan base, he says as follows. He says like this. He says, Af she'ein oil beloit fanos. It's true that there's no oil without walls. Mikol makom choshev oil arai. It's still called a temporary tent. But also midrabanan. Why? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Why? Why is it also? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Kevan shenase hasafa lios litzail. Because the brim of the hat, is made for shade. Lahager mipnei hashemesh. I don't know. Would you beg to differ that it's not there for shade? I don't know. When I'm walking in the sun, I'm very happy that I've got my hat to give me shade. In the rain, I'm not happy because I'm upset about my hat getting ruined. But apart from that, I would be happy that my hat is protecting me from the rain. Yes. Yes. Yes, because it's civilized. I agree, because it's civilized and it's respectful to wear your hat. But nonetheless, what I'm suggesting is that even though the hat has become, well, I mean, it used to be. Nowadays, it's just either you're a Haredi or a gangster. But the original hat, I'm saying that's nowadays. But the original hat, why did people conceive of a hat before it became fashionable to wear a hat? For protection. Once you had a garment that was there for protection, then we made it into a fashion instrument and decided to have cool hats. So yeah, so it's baseball caps are an interesting question. Certainly these ladies' hats, they're very soft and floppy. So those are certainly not a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Kovish Goren Bretlich, he says, he says, Nergim by Lahakel and Kasvach Redim Kamat Stodim Batam, right? He says another Batam Eteram. He says a number of reasons why we're making. Meaning the Mishnah Berurah is bothered. People wear these firm hats, and I think the same thing he would be bothered by baseball caps. And therefore the Mishnah Berurah says, let me give you a few ideas. First of all, it's not so firm. Nechbaf lemata. It's not so firm, and therefore we're okay with it. And you know what? I would say that about a baseball cap also. It's kind of floppy. It's not so rigid. The Rosh Hashivish hats are much stronger than baseball caps. So I think I'm sorry. No, if it's a tefach and it's stretched out and it's there to protect you and it's relatively flat, meaning if it would be on a real slant, but baseball caps are not on a well, I have to consult. Right, I have to consult with my fashion advisor on that one. And then the Mishnah Berurah says, you know what? He says, often, really, a lot of people, they don't care about the shade. All they want is they're interested in the fashion, not in the shade. And therefore, if you're not interested in the shade, then even if it's giving you shade, but that's not your purpose. Again, baseball caps, you want the shade, right? And then he says, if there's a slant, all right, he says a number of meriheta. Tachlis, the minig is lahakel. And I'm saying, even though you do spend some time in a hat shop, you'll see people measuring, taking out their measuring tapes and being worried about their tefachs. But nonetheless, the minig is lahakel. And the Mishnah Berurah says that there's makom lahakel based on Shitas Rashi, that there's no issur at all in wearing hats. I'm sorry? Oh, we're only talking about the rim, only the part that goes beyond your head. Because the top bit is for it's worn. The top it is considered that you're wearing it on your head. This is like wearing a shirt. Wearing a shirt, even though it's protecting your shoulders, that wouldn't be an oil because it's worn. You don't say, oh, that's a tent. It's not a tent. It's just you're wearing it on your head. It's like wearing a woolly hat, right? So a woolly hat is not a tent. It's protecting your head, but it's not a tent. And the same thing applies for, even though there might be a bit of air between your top of your head and the top of the hat, but that's still not called a tent. But the part that's protruding beyond your head, that's already getting into the tent areas. I'm sorry again? Yes, it can be a separate piece. Mishmura says if it's a separate piece, then what? Well, it's not the Mishmura. Chazon Ish says that if it's a separate piece, then one should preferably slide it from the side of the oil outwards and not bring it in the other way. Interesting chiddush. I think right. No, Rashi is speaking about a machzeles, a mat that's rolled up and you're spreading, but it's lav dafka. Once there's an oil, then you can extend the oil, and that's fine. And that's why, for example, on your sukkahs, for example, you can't add to a sukkah. Well, adding to a sukkah is a problem. It's a number of problems. First of all, because it's an oil keva. Yes. Right. It's arai. Right. It's a dira sarai, but it's an oil keva. But another problem is muktzah, because once you're putting up the schach, then it's being muktzah. It's being mevatel kli mechana, meaning it's so schach has a problem of muktzah as well as a problem of oil. Yeah. So yeah. Well, let me just mention a couple of other things. We'll get to umbrellas next week in Mit Hashem, and to tents and games and stuff like that. All fun and games, actually. But let me just mention, if we're speaking about adding things, so if we're speaking about a tablecloth, so the putting on a tablecloth, the Mishabura says, is certainly fine, even if you're going over a hole or something like that in the table. Mishabura says, I'll read it. He says, he says, number one, we're not interested in the air under the shulchan. I mentioned before that a table is a machlokes. Shulchan Aruch says we don't want the air under the table. We want what's on top of the table and not what's under the table. And then he gives another reason why that's mutter. Well, you know what? We have another minute. I'll just mention umbrellas issues, but we'll get to it next week, I think, because it's still a lot to speak about. Toilet seat? First of all, creative question. Yes, because you're covering it. But you're covering it for aesthetics. Yeah, you're not covering it because you want to use the area. You're not protecting the area under it. You keep it covered for aesthetic purposes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Let me just point out a quick introduction to umbrellas. Umbrellas came along sometime in the, I don't know, 18th century, I guess. They were mischadesh, right? The idea of an umbrella was mischadesh. Well, again, there's two issues. There's one issue of opening an umbrella on Shabbos. There's another issue of carrying an umbrella on Shabbos. Okay, so where the poskim are extremely busy is on the question of opening an umbrella on Shabbos, and we have, very radical. The Nodi B'Yehuda says it's a doraisa, and the Chasam Sofer basically says that it's mutter, even though he qualifies this somewhat at the end. And then Ohr Chadash is very stark and said it's also, but that's the main question that the poskim are dealing with, is the question of opening an umbrella on Shabbos. In terms of carrying an umbrella that was already open from before Shabbos, then the Chazon Ish says that there's no problem of carrying. The Chazon Ish is speaking about our question of wearing a hat, right, on Shabbos. And the Chazon Ish says, well, okay, there's a problem of wearing a hat on Shabbos. What about like carrying a hat? Okay, I'm not wearing it. I just want to like hold it up or something, right? I'm carrying a hat rather than wearing a hat. And on that, the Chazon Ish says that wouldn't be any problem. There's actually an interesting discussion about this. The Shulchan, he disagrees, I think. Who is it that disagrees with the Chazon Ish on this? Yeah, the Shulchan. He argues on the Chazon Ish, but the Chazon Ish says no. If you're just holding up the oil on Shabbos, right? You're holding this in your hand. Then he said that's not similar that's not similar to a hat. Well, it's interesting. He compares it to a. Interesting. I'm just reading it now. I'm just reading the Chazon Ish now. He says it's the other way around. He says like this. He says if you're holding something up, then that's called an oil. That's worse than a hat. The Shulchan says no, it's mutter. Just like a hat is mutter, so holding it up is mutter. The Chazon Ish says no. The Chazon Ish says it's worse, it's aser. But you know what? Let's speak about this next week when we talk about umbrellas, and then we'll have the both questions. One, opening up the umbrella, and the other question, let's say the umbrella is open from before Shabbos. Are you allowed to walk around with an umbrella outside? I know it's unusual. We don't see much of this, but maybe it's mutter. So join us next week and we'll talk about it. Good. Spreading the talisim as a canopy or just wearing the talis over the head? Well, that's very floppy. That's very floppy. Meaning, even if the hat. But Simchas Torah, making a canopy. Yeah, absolutely. How many? 9? Why not 10? Ohr אשר בדברים מעריב ערבים, וחוכמה בשיח שיעורים ובספון המשנה יריתם, ומחלק את הזמנים וסבי הסכים, ומשמרי סיים ברציח כרצים את זה.
Shabbos Echad, Hasheminu Le'olamim, Baruch Atah Adonai Ohev Amo Yisrael.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. היו הדברים האלה שהולכים לצורך היום על לבבך ושננתם לבניך ודיברת בו ושבתך בביסך ולכתך בדרך ובשכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לסנדך ויולת תפס בין עינך וחשפתם ומזזה יספיסך ובשמך ואבירים שמיה תשמרם לתפיסה ישמח מתפייסך ואבכם אחרונים Maybe tell you that one.
Adonai Elohechem, Emes. חוזר רצון קיבלו להם, השם נשאר לכם לשם שמחה רבה, ויאמרו כולם. חוזר הרב בניך ויקי יום לפעמים אשר זה אלי, יאמרו ויאמרו. שהם כי בדד ועצת קבלו להם יד חסם ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גואל ישראל. Zeynu eno cham shalom taviat alam baruch ata Adonai shememo Israel Dayan Davis Kadash Meraba Yamad Rach Yerusei Nishma Say B'Chayacham Yamecham Chadach Beisram B'Galav Zman Karit Nomei Nomei Namav Le'olam Hayam Yisrael Shabbat Yisrael Shabbat Shabbat Elam Mikam Chasav V'Shirasav Chasav V'Nechem Asav Armi Amav Nomei Amen. Davis Gadash Meraba, Yamad Rock, who say on Nick Mark, say, but I can't make on Friday Hall based job. I got his man Karim and Romain.
Omenish may have a Mavach,
Yes, practice the back of Paris and say, Salash, make the Shabbos. Elam Mikal Fasav, Shira Sach, Savnak Masad, and Mav Romain. This guy Bell, son of us, and the Kabisha Karan Shamir Romain. And the Ram Khan made Rokai Sham Romain. Sham Rama, here's Shamalay Neva Kai Sham Romain. I ain't a Shabbat, I don't like call him. Emma Bayana Mekalares, Emma Khadish Makad, the Davis Gadash Meraba, Yamadi Rock, you say, Nick Mark say, but I have on your make on quite a call basis job. Bagalav's man Karim in Romain. Hey, Shmei, Habam Brak, Nelano Albaya. Yes, Brak, Shabbat, Miss Paris, say, Silabis, Salash, make the Shabbat. Elam Mikal Kasav, Shira Sach, Wasav Nef Masad, or name of Romain. It's Brak, I'm made about Kaisam Romain. I said, Rama, yes, Ramalenu, Bakosam, Romain. Barabu S. Anaimara. Thank everyone for making marriage tonight.
Should be Le'ili Nishmas.
Thank you. I'm not going to say anything because it's a busy night and I'm speaking tomorrow night in Shul, so I'll give it about Torah and say something then. I'll just really say one thing, which is many things my mom did, but the thing that so grateful for is raising us, etc. But she fought hard to bring Torah and religion into her life, and only really through her and my father as well. She started the journey. Do we have the source of being here and part of this wonderful community in Lamont and part of this lovely Yiddishkeit that we've got over here. So big shkoyach and thank you. And invite you for a l'chaim now. We'll bring out some cholent and kugel, and then we'll settle back in our seats and count with a wonderful part two. Yeah, help yourself for a start. Come out.
Yeah, I dived earlier. I'm number 10. Starting it. Oh, really? Yeah. You get ripped in. Yeah. I got used to that. So the Mashana with the baseball match, it's okay. Because last week after we went for a walk and I came back. No way. Yeah, so my wife's like, next week you gotta make sure to wear a hat. Yeah, it's okay. Everyone sees that everyone is making. I mean, right. We bring many reasons that's not so great, but the minute gets to be making, and that's good. And what about opening up exposure from exfolded state? That's fine. Now we'll speak about next week. Right. That's so I have to be more careful. I have to be more careful. Right.
You didn't invest another 2 more hours in this year. You can't get all the answers right away. That's all.
Yeah, but I also have a Shabbos. There's Shabbos in between now and then. Yeah, but that's okay. But yeah, just open which often means that you do have to. Right. I have 2 strollers. One of them can open beforehand. So you have to make sure. Right, but it has to be like open in a way that it's right. No, you could open it. One of them you could open. David Price is in the house. I know it's massive. Oh my God! That's my other pair of glasses. Hey, how are you? No, it's very good to see you. You know what? It did. Yeah, but that's a good. I am deeply offended. Yes, we've all heard that before. I use that line. You still have to use.
All right, Price is here just in time.
There you go. No way. You know what? David, come on. Please.
No, now you touched it. There's a COVID thing.
That's it. I touched it. All right. Thank you very much. Much appreciated, Andy. That's not true. I'm a real rabbi. I do.
Evan, David wants to. He thought he...
Let me see if there's no. Yes, with the phone. Blown away by so much money. It's one of those things.
None of my shiur has.
Did anyone not get? I think we're all concerned. Only guy right now is Lewis. And you? Very good.
And the guys already like, they do all like and we have
That's meant to be a big kid. When you get
No, yes. We're doing a new one. Your dad said, Uncle Ben, we're doing a new one. That's a football.